Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Asim Chandra, host for this podcast series called Rev Signal. This is our 30th episode. We are fortunate to have Ed Powers join us today from Service Excellence Partners. Ed, take a minute to introduce yourself, and then I'm going to set the context about what we're going to be discussing today. I think it's going to be a very exciting session and very rich in terms of practical advice and insights that any CS team or CS ops team can use. So Ed, quick introduction to who you are and your background. Let's start there.
Great. Well, thanks, Asim. I appreciate the opportunity to join you today. My name is Ed Powers. I've been in business a long time, lots of gray hair, 37 years in business. I have lots of big company experience, started my career at HP many years ago in sales and marketing and operations. Done 4 startups, so I've been on the startup side as well, and work with mid-sized companies too. So I've kind of seen the gamut. I have been consulting for on and off for about 20 years or so. I've been in operating roles in customer success as well as consulting in customer success and customer experience. In the last few years, I've jumped back into it full time, and I'm doing consulting work with companies that range from startups to multi-billion-dollar global companies.
Fantastic. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we encourage you to participate in the conversation. Our intention here is to learn from each other, to grow our knowledge, to walk away with some practical insights that we can use in our business. The best way to ask your questions is to drop them into the webinar chat session. So we are live in the chat session. If you have any questions, please drop them there. And just by way of introduction, it'd be great if you could share which company you work for and what's your role there. You could also share where you're joining in from today. That would be awesome. So there's Lina from Immersa, of course, joining us from Utah. Lina, good to see you here. This podcast series is hosted by Immersa.ai. So if you have any interest in what Immersa can help with, go check us out on Immersa.ai as well. Okay, so today's session is really focused on customer success teams, product teams, and operations teams. And it focuses on a topic that I know is very important to each one of these different personas, which is how to use statistical modeling techniques, and in particular, regression analysis, to empower you to go beyond intuition and accurately predict customer outcomes. So Ed's going to share some real-world examples. We're going to use this to deepen our understanding of how predictive technologies work, and how you can use forecasting techniques to discover new insights, new opportunities in your install base and make some data-driven decisions. We'll apply these regression techniques to some real-world examples as well. And there's a huge amount of discussion and conversation that happens around health scores in this industry. In fact, we were recently at the Gainsight conference with Pulse 2023. And probably one of the heaviest attended sessions were the ones around how to measure health scores, what's the value of health scores. And so we'll talk about that as well in terms of how you can apply some modeling techniques to improve the way that you look at health scores. Okay, so Ed, let's just quickly start with a quick introduction to what your company does today.
Sure. Well, what I do is I consult with people. My superpower, my area of expertise is really threefold. One is actually applying analytics to the customer journey. So actually using some of the math we'll talk about today. I have a superpower in the area of neuroscience. I'm very interested in how the brain works. So I apply that to the customer experience. The more we know about how the brains of our customers work and our own brains, the better we can do for them. And the last thing I focus on is continuous improvement, is helping organizations get better at what they do.
Fantastic. So Ed, I talk to a lot of people in the customer success domain, and the perception typically is that CS teams are very relationship driven. The tools at their disposal are, QBRs and NPS scores and so on. You, of course, come at it from a very analytical, mathematical approach to understanding how customers are actually interacting with your brand and where there's risk, where there's opportunity. So let's just maybe start with what is statistical modeling, and in particular, what is regression analysis? How does it help drive outcomes?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, regression analysis is a technique that people use to analyze data and to build mathematical models that describe relationships between random variables. So to give you an example of that, intuitively, we know that, there's probably some relationship between a person's height and their weight, right? And if we were to gather a set of data, and we have, for example, in a spreadsheet, if you will, you have, in the rows, names of people, and in the columns, one column which describes their height and one column that describes their weight. And you do a scattergram of that, right? You put the height in the x-axis and the weight in the y-axis. What you'll see is a bunch of dots, right? And those dots represent people. And what you'll see is a lot of noise and a lot of dots kind of there, but you'll see kind of a general trend. You'll see that there's, as the height increases, so does the weight. And this is what you would expect, right? When you have a tall person, there's more mass there. So of course they're going to weigh more than a person who's a little bit shorter. So it turns out there is a mathematical relationship between those two things. And if we're looking at that scattergram, it's entirely possible for us to draw a line through that, a very simple straight line. And if we remember our high school math, the equation of a line is y equals ax plus b, where a is your slope and b is your y-intercept, right? So what regression does is it takes that data and it gives you what a and b are. Yeah, and if you know A and B, you can draw a line between those. And that's really what regression does. So there are some examples of that. And if you draw that line through that noisy data, you're going to find out, lo and behold, it doesn't predict everything exactly. In fact, interestingly, the correlation between height and weight is about 0.5, roughly, which means that only about 25% of weight can be described or can be characterized by someone's height. So the other 75% comes from other factors, things like age and gender and health choices, right? Diet and exercise, genetics. And as you add more and more factors to your mathematical model, then you're going to be able to predict with much more accuracy. But regression is basically that, is that I have some variable or some set of variables and I want to try to explain some outcome from some set of inputs, and I do that mathematically.
Makes a lot of sense. And the example that you shared, I think all of us can relate to. I tell people that I'm always trying to grow taller to match my height to my weight. So totally relate. So I can come back to the slope y equals ax plus b and be on that slope, not be an outlier. But let's translate this into what this means for customer success. In the context of customer success, what are some of the common outcomes or variables that we can think about that help us understand regression in that context?
Yeah, and we can use it for just about everything that we care about, right? We care about logo churn, we care about product churn, we care about expansion revenue, we care if our accounts are contracting. So all of those things that we are held accountable to, we can model using regression. And we can also use it for studying any relationship between any factors, right? Any kind of cause and effect relationship we can model.
Got it. And are there other statistical modeling techniques that you apply to look at data in the customer success domain and trying to understand what's really going on?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different tools that you can use. There's factor analysis, just looking at simple covariance. Is there some relationship between these two? Maybe you don't want to model it directly. You can compare, different groups to each other. You can look at whether or not there's a apparent difference or a real difference. You can track progress over time. You can use control charts. So there's all kinds of tools that you use to analyze your data and to make sense of what's happening in your world.
Got it. Okay, great. Now, I think from your perspective, you have a very well-defined methodology in terms of how to develop effective health scores using regression analysis. Is one of the topics that I think is of high interest to anybody in this domain. Maybe if you could share that a little bit in terms of what that process looks like for you.
Yeah, and this is what's really worked well for me. Oddly enough, it's a 6-step process, and it doesn't start with data, and it doesn't start with math. It starts with talking to your customers, right? At the end of the day, you want to understand, why are customers renewing? Why are they quitting and churning and going somewhere else? Why are they buying more? Why are they buying less? So it starts with customers. What's going on with them, right? So the first step is to actually go talk to your customers. Then from that, they're going to give you a set of reasons. Well, this is why I decided what I decided. And then you want to quantify that, right? How often are they saying that? What revenue is tied to that? And you can do very simple Pareto analysis, which is incredibly valuable. Now you can start to build a business case for changing some things. So you quantify, that's the next step. Then what you want to do is you want to look upstream in your process and say, okay, what's happening? What's causing this thing happening downstream? So for example, you talk to your customers and they say, you know what, it just wasn't a good fit for our needs. Okay, well, where do we have fit? Where do we measure fit? Where do we find that in our process upstream? Are we measuring that? How are we measuring that? Right? So we expect, and we create a hypothesis that says, you know what? If we improve our fit, we'll have less churn. So we start to build these beliefs or these expectations of cause and effect, right? So then when we have that, what do we do next? Well, we go gather some data. And then we start to screen those factors, and we can narrow that list of factors down, because some things that customers talk about, when we actually pull the data and we actually look at it, they're not predictive. And then other things are, that there's some relationship between those two. So we narrow those list of factors down, and now we apply things like regression. Now we can say, okay, these factors seem to affect these outcomes. Let's build a mathematical model and let's test it. So you do that exercise, and now you have something that will predict an outcome, will predict that churn or that renewal. And then what you do is you deploy that in your operations. You start to use it, and then you monitor and improve it.
Yeah. So I think, this it's very helpful to understand this methodology, and it's very well structured and defined the way that you just took us through it. That said, in practical experience, when we meet with clients, we see them, there's a data orientation somewhere in that organization that is sort of following the kind of steps that you're going through. But then there's usually an executive who's responsible for, say, an NRR number for the business, who is looking at the data, but then also turning towards their customer success rep and saying, hey, what's really going on in this account? Do you think it's likely to churn? And sometimes there's a lot of discrepancy between what the data might be predicting and what the human in the loop is articulating as potential risk or not in the model. So how does regression analysis help us overcome some of the perhaps flawed human perception at certain points? Curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and it's not to say that human intuition is not valuable. It is, and we'll talk in a minute about that. And there are times and places where that's your best bet, right? But what typically happens, and you mentioned being at the Gainsight conference, and this is true with any platform provider, and I've sat in on these calls, and you may have as well, or some of the folks on the line here have had that conversation where, they're setting up your customer success platform, and they say, okay, let's set up your customer health scores. And they say, okay, what's your model now? What are you doing? Well, we're not really doing much of anything. Okay. Well, our other customers are using things like NPS and tickets, open tickets, and engagement and sentiment and all these other things. What do you think? Customer says, well, that sounds good. What do you, we'll pick these. Okay, well, let's start with open support cases. How many are a problem for you? What causes risk? I don't know, maybe 3. Okay, well, let's write that down. All right, well, then you go through and let's weight some of these. How much weight do you want to apply to NPS? Well, I don't know. What do you recommend? So they go through this conversation, and even though they have some data, there's a lot of subjectivity in how much weighting you put on it and which ones you even pick, right? So is that better than just going with a gut feel? Well, it can be, but it's probably not as good as it really needs to be, right? So regression is a way that you can start to introduce some real data and derive it from the data itself, and not from what your gut is about the data that you're looking at, right? So it's a shift in how you think about it.
Got it. Got it. And, when we last met, you had talked about this idea of, Kahneman's book, if I pronounced that name correctly. Share a little bit about that. Like how does human judgment work since you study the brain?
Yeah, this is a great story. Daniel Kahneman, he's a Nobel Prize winning behavioral economist, and he wrote a book with two of his colleagues, Olivier Saboni and Cass Sunstein. And the book is called Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment. And the whole book is about this perception that we have about our subjective assessments, our subjective judgment of things. And things like insurance adjusters and when they evaluate risk, or hiring managers when they are comparing candidates for a new job, or judges and the legal system and how they judge cases. And they go through very systematically, and they show that we think that we are much better judges than we actually are. That there's a tremendous amount of variation because of how we interpret things, and our realities are all a little bit different. So what they show in this book is that as you add more mechanical means, things like a rule that you use, or some correlation that you have, or even a simple correlated model, or the next level up, regression modeling, and then above that, AI and machine learning. And progressively, as you go and use more of these mechanical means, the more accurate, the more consistent you are in your judgment. So it's a great book. I highly recommend it. And it directly applies to everything we're talking about in customer success and revenue operations. We tend to believe that human judgment is really accurate when it actually isn't. And doing anything is going to help you have better judgment.
Got it. I think that's very helpful context. Ed, coming back to our discussion on health scores, what are some of the key variables or factors that you recommend people consider? I mean, obviously, you sort of talked through the approach in that previous discussion, but rather than look to what someone else has done, how should we look inward towards what our business looks like, and then identify the variables that are important?
Yeah, and this is why you want to go through that process, because there's a ton of stuff out there. You go on LinkedIn, or there's a ton of blogs. Oh, these are the metrics you really need to measure. These are the ones that matter. That's great. But what matters to you in your business? That's a different question. And the fact is, it depends. One size does not fit all. What works in one environment will not work in another. And you have to do your homework, right? You can't just copy what someone else does and expect the same results. It's not how life works. So you need to go through that process. If you want to get some ideas, great, get some ideas, but test them, because they may apply to you, they may not. Typically, you hear about things like usage, or, certain feature usage, or adoption or onboarding, NPS, which is usually not a very good indicator, but people use it anyway. Engagement, support tickets, all these things that we just mentioned. There's other ones that people hardly ever talk about that I've found seem to be predictive, like fit. If there's a fit here, that's, customers say that a lot. How are you measuring your fit? Things like customer goal achievement. A lot of times people forget about that. The whole goal is to help customers achieve their goals. How are we measuring that, right? That's another one that seems to be predictive. Trust. Levels of trust, that is predictive of outcomes. So there's a whole set of other things that you can explore to test out in your environment. Go get the data, find out. It may apply to you, it may not. So, and then good models, they don't have 138 different factors in them. They have a handful, maybe 5 to 7 is all you need. That really is going to be predictive of your outcomes.
Got it. It makes a lot of sense. In fact, one of the anecdotally, one of the points we picked up on is the best predictor of churn is when the exec sponsor leaves and there is not a good transition in place. So we constantly hear a requirement from Immersa customers asking for, how do I get a signal into my CS team if the sponsor for my account ups and leaves, and there's a LinkedIn update is how we find out.
Yeah.
So I think there are some simple sort of indicators like that that are kind of non-traditional that most people don't look at. In fact, again, another example of a customer that we work with where high usage, so sort of flatline for a while and then suddenly usage spikes up, is actually an indicator that they're downloading a bunch of data to move to a different platform, not necessarily an indicator of they're starting to use the product more. So,
Right.
Very interesting sort of observations that depend upon the context of your business and what you're trying to solve for. But I think your point about the non-traditional ways in which to look at the metrics is a really important one. A whole other discussion on NPS, which we'll pick up one of these days.
It's a good one.
It's a good one. Okay, so how can customer success teams leverage regression analysis to identify early warning signs and predict customer churn? So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and this is the real intention, most times of health scores is where do I focus my time? What do I do today? Right. So that is obviously an intention. And like you said, what are the triggers? What are the things I need to watch for? How does this adjust today, given the information that we have today? So critical events is certainly one area, but I think most critical is not what happens with an individual account, but what happens with all of your accounts, right? And how do you use regression to drive change and improvement in your organization? The best way to solve a problem is to prevent it from ever occurring in the first place.
Yeah.
So how do we go and influence change within our organization using this data? And ultimately, that's where you get the big breakthroughs, is how do we improve our products? How do we improve our service? How do we improve our processes such that we can retain more customers and grow them?
Yeah. So we have a dozen or so people on the call right now that are live. If you're joining us for the first time, we'd love to hear about who you are, where you're from, which company do you work for, so we kind of get to know each other a little bit. Our intention is for this to be conversational, so please jump in and ask your questions. You can drop your questions in the webinar chat, or you can raise your hand. We can open up the line to you and you can ask the questions directly of Ed or myself. But we would welcome your participation in the webinar. I want to make sure that you walk away with some insights that are useful for you in your current context. So feel free to jump in with specific questions that are important to you. I'm going to keep this moving along. There are lots of challenges in how data is available, organized, quality, et cetera. So what are some of the considerations that a CS team should be aware of when they're trying to use regression analysis in terms of, related to the data?
Sure, and great question. So the first is you got to know a little something about statistics, right? If you're going to be using it, you need to have some base level understanding of what it is and what it means. And I actually teach a course on this, which will, we can provide that link. But you need to understand what are these basic tools and how do they work and what are the limitations of those, right? So there's a great quote from a guy by the name of George Box, who is a famed statistician. He says, all models are wrong, some are useful. And that's true with anything, whether we're talking about regression or, chat GPT or you name it, no model is perfect. So it's all about trade-offs and picking the right one and understanding how they work. So there needs to be some core foundation of the mechanics of that. So I highly recommend that. And that is a challenge because most people do not understand even the basics, right? So you need to get some base level. The other is you need to know your customers and your processes. One of the things that's true about data scientists are really good with the math, but they may not know the practical application. They don't know what you know about your customers and your processes and your segments. So your subject matter expertise is really, really helpful. So you want to add that and then add some math to it. Now you got a winning combination. Modeling, by the way, is the easy part. There's so much software out there. If you can get a data model, if you can get the data, it's a couple of mouse clicks and it's done, right? What you need to know is which models work and how do they work to some level and know what the trade-offs are. But the hardest thing is actually what you and your team are doing, Asim, with Immersa, is solving the data problem. How do I get all this stuff? Because it's everywhere, right? A data scientist's job, is not about science, it's about data. more than anything else.
Right.
And so that's the hardest piece, is how do we set up that data architecture? How do we clean that data? What's relevant, what's not? How do we do this? How do we get it out of systems and clean it and load it and put it in the right place? That's where the time is really consumed. Those are the biggest challenges.
Got it. Got it. Great. Now, I know you work with a lot of clients over the course of your career, and of course, as part of your current focus on educating folks on data science and statistics and so on, and applied in this domain. Can you share some customer success stories or case studies where regression analysis has really significantly helped improve business outcomes?
Yeah, I got a couple of examples. One was I was working with a client where we built a customer health score that was 80% predictive of churn using just 2 factors. And this was a company that was a tech-enabled service provider. They were working with SMB accounts, and they did appointment setting. And they had a churn problem. And they said, can you come in and take a look at our data? So I did that. And the first thing we did is we said, what are your customers telling you, right? Start with customers. And they were saying, the reason why we are quitting is, and they gave a set of reasons. One of them was quality. The quality of the appointments you were setting up for us, the prospects, was not what we expected. So they said right away, quality was a big factor. But they also mentioned some other things, like the volume of appointments that you're setting for me, the number of no-shows, right? We have our representative on the line, the other person doesn't show up, people aren't very happy about that, right? So that was a complaint. They also mentioned that, our needs changed or whatever. So there were some other factors. So we analyzed that and then said, okay, let's look upstream in the process. What could be causing this? So after going through and setting up these hypotheses, we narrowed the list to 4 factors. So the 4 were quality, because customers were saying that, no shows, the length of time they were with the company, because tenure seemed to have some association to that, and the no-shows that were there as well. So there were all 4 of these factors. Then we did regression analysis, logistic regression, and guess what? 2 of the factors dropped out, one of them being quality. Surprisingly, the big thing that the customers were talking about went away. It was not predictive. The other 2 factors was the volume of the bookings and the no-shows. That's it. And that predicted 80% of the churn behavior. So what does that mean? Well, we built a customer health score. Here you go. If you want to predict what these people are doing, just look at these 2 numbers. It's going to tell you what that is. And we color-coded that. But more importantly, it gave them direction on what they had to really pay attention to and improve. How do we get more appointments, especially in the early stages? And how do we make sure customers show up, these prospects show up? Because we know those are the things that drive the behavior. So that's a great example, and that's 80% on 2. Can we get it up to better predictive accuracy? Absolutely.
Sure.
Continue to iterate on this, get it up in the 90s, and absolutely that could happen. So.
Got it. There's a great question here from Elizabeth Miller about what roadblocks might a CS person encounter when espousing regression analysis of customer behavior. And so organizationally, I assume, Elizabeth, is what you mean, and feel free to clarify. But what advice would you have to kind of break through that?
Well, you probably get support from your leadership if you explain it this way, is that, we want to have less of a watermelon problem, green on the outside, red on the inside. We don't want surprises. And this is a way to kind of eliminate some surprises. And we spend our resources doing the things that are actually productive, not the things that aren't. People will kind of get that. I think the biggest challenge, though, is data. I mean, it's really getting at that data and how do I pull it together? And some people are very protective of their data. No, you can't have this, or, what's your do you have the permissions to do this? That's always the biggest barrier, the challenge. That anytime we dig into these things is getting access to it, cleaning it. People will use the same term and mean 2 different things. So the data, you got to go through all this cleaning. So as soon as you start unpacking that, you find out that there's way more to this than you thought. And then you have to break down those other barriers.
Got it. Elizabeth, if you have any follow-on questions, please feel free to jump in, and hopefully that addressed at least part of what you were asking. And from an organizational perspective, I'm kind of building on what Elizabeth is, and we'll get to her question here in a moment. You know, what actions to take afterward is one that I'm really passionate about, because I've been in those shoes for too long, where you have all the data that you need at your fingertips, but then how do you translate that into action? So we'll come to that in a moment. I think it's a deeper conversation to be had there. One of the reasons why Immersa.ai exists, actually. And so I just want to go back to this issue of data, who owns it, who has access to it, how do you kind of break through some of these challenges? If there's some quick wins that can be demonstrated that kind of help break through some of that kind of internal thinking that holds people back.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's garbage in, garbage out, right? So you have to have something that's working, and to break through very quickly, you can take a couple of factors that you know are that actually are predictive, and with a very quick test, you can show, if we see this, then we are likely to see this other behavior, right? You can do that even with one factor. You can start to show that. And as people start to understand what you mean by that, and you can characterize that, then you can say, well, what more can we look at? Well, now I need to get data from these other places. So even just to get people understanding what you're talking about, take one factor and see how that applies to that behavior. And you can very simply write an equation for that. You can show how predictive it is and say, okay, imagine we have 5 to 7 of these that really predict 80, 90% of this, right? What's the value of that? So I think once you kind of start, you can take it down that path for sure.
Got it. Now, if we were to sort of build on Elizabeth's question, like once you have an understanding of where there's possibly churn, what actions can you take to avoid it? Besides I'll do a QBR, I'll call the customer, which seems to be like the go-to playbook for a lot of CS teams.
Yeah, and it all depends upon context, right? I mean, this is where you launch, and a lot of these platforms will launch playbooks or, you know, processes, workflows to go deal with this problem. So, you know, if you get a red signal, and you haven't been talking to that customer for a while, go talk to them. Yeah, we notice these things. These things change. Does anything change in your business? What's going on? And you know, that starts a whole conversation. And then you'll know what to do, right? So it could be that we're really incredibly frustrated right now. We have this open support ticket. You guys have been lying to us for 6 months about this new thing. Oh, let me look into that for you. You know, there will be some obvious action that comes from that, or that you need to do a full account turnaround. Maybe something's going on there. So it really depends upon the context and the investigation that you have, and what's the prescription here. So that's solving the problem for an individual account. But again, what's the action here? There's things that a CSM can do, there's things that a CSM leader can do, and there's things that the CEO must do, right? And all of that is derived from the data. Systemic improvement of product, service, processes, the CEO owns that, right? Because it's going to occur everywhere in your organization. Mm-hmm. And he or she or they needs to initiate that and get people to fix those things.
Got it. That's really cool. So subjectivity from a CSM lens, where does that work? And, is there ways, and actually I would maybe even build on that question a little bit to say, is there a way to measure which human in their subjective, which CSM in their subjective assessments is more accurate than a human that is, providing predictions but is not accurate? Like, can you assess CSMs using these techniques?
You certainly can, and you'll get a distribution, right? Yeah. You're going to get some that are really good and some that are not so good. What you're looking for are the outliers, right? What are those people that are insanely good at it? What are they doing? Or what are those people that are really horrible at it? What aren't they doing right? And so you can use data to kind of look at that. If they fall on a standard normal, it's all about the same, and who cares? But yes, you can identify people who are outliers and say, what are they doing differently here, good or bad? But subjectivity absolutely has a place. And, in one of my last operating roles in customer success, I was at a company called IntelliSecure, and that was a managed service provider. Excuse me. And our CSMs had very large accounts. They had, 8 or 9 accounts each. And they were talking to these accounts every week or every other week. And it was not just them, it was a team of people that they were interacting with on both sides. So they really had good depth in each one of these accounts. There were not a whole lot of surprises. There was not a whole lot of data, but when we said, hey, what's your red, yellow, green on this? They knew exactly what was going on, right? They had that small number of accounts, but great depth. And we were not surprised very much. In fact, everybody in the organization knew what the issues were with some of these red accounts. Where that starts to break is where you have more than 8 accounts and you have less and less contact. You have to start to rely more on these mechanical means that we talked about, because those subjective assessments are going to run out of gas. Okay, I'm calling these folks red. Okay, well, when's the last time you talked to them? 3 months ago. Okay, well, maybe things have changed, right? And then now you have to use more mechanical means there.
Got it. So I'm going to stick to the math, dig a little bit deeper, help us understand factor analysis, and what is the process of developing predictive models using factor analysis.
Yeah, so factor analysis is also called exploratory data analysis, but the idea is that you look for relationships between random variables. So you look, and there are tools, there are tests that you use that say, is there covariance? In other words, if I see something move over here, does something correspondingly move over there? Is there dependence or is there independence? And there are statistical tests that will tell you to some level of confidence whether or not there is a relationship between the two. So there's different tools like ANOVA, there's correlation, which we all know about. There's what are called non-parametric assessments when it's not normally distributed data. So you pick the right thing, like Pearson's chi-square, Spearman's rho. There's a set of other tests that you can run given what kind of data you're looking at. But it will tell you, is there a relationship or isn't there? To what level of confidence? And if there's a moderate to strong relationship, guess what? You're probably going to drop that in your model and see what happens. What regression allows you to do is to take those and now start to say, well, relatively, what do these factors mean? Which are the ones that are really important when you take a set of factors, and which are the ones that you can pull out? And that narrows your list even further. And again, it all boils down to usually a small set of factors that predict most of it.
Got it. Cool. Okay, so in terms of best practices, how do you, are there some suggestions you might have on how to sort of keep these models maintained over time? Are they relevant for certain duration and then not afterwards? Maybe talk a little bit about what are some of the best practices around how do you maintain this work over time?
Yeah, and again, all models go bad because things change, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're all based upon history, whether we're talking about regression or AI, machine learning, you name it. It's all based, you train it on the history. So if something fundamentally changes, of course, the accuracy is going to go down. So if there's a major shift like COVID, or you've launched a major new product or new competitors come on, there's disruptive change going on, the model is going to start being inaccurate. The other thing is that there are long-term shifts that happen, and the model that you have today is going to be different from the model that you need 2 years from now. So you can monitor that, continue to look at how predictive is this, what is that accuracy, and you'll see it dwindle over time. And guess what? You'll hit a threshold and say, okay, let's take another look at this, right? So it's not just put it on the calendar. You can actually measure this and see, is it degrading? Oh, that it's degrading. We need to go back and revisit it, right? So, and this is true no matter how you do your modeling.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's something that you do is you monitor it, you improve it, you watch for those things. And then one thing to keep in mind is that as your performance gets better, as you start to drive more and more churn out of your system and you start to grow things, you need to have better measurement. You actually need to improve your measurement system because you have to be able to detect those smaller and smaller changes. So as you improve, you're going to need to update your models too. So those are all factors to keep in mind.
Got it. So I want to turn the conversation towards tools. There's a billion knowledge workers that use one of the most popular regression modeling tools without actually knowing it, which is Excel or Google Sheets.
Yep.
But if you were to advise folks here in terms of kind of breaking down the landscape of what these different tools look like, and we're part of that landscape as well in terms of what we offer our clients, but kind of take us through a little bit of what that landscape looks like. What are some of the common tools that you work with yourself or that you recommend people try out to get an understanding of this, as they get an understanding of this domain, that they can start to implement it?
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, Excel has wonderful tools in it already. In fact, it has a free, plug-in, a data analysis tool pack, which I teach in my class. It's all free. So, and obviously you need Excel, but it's a free plugin and it does a lot of this. There are other plugins for Excel and so forth that are available. And of course, there's professional, statistical software, Minitab and SPSS and SAS and Alteryx, a wonderful product, Alteryx. So there's a lot of tools out there that are robust with all kinds of models in there. And you can pull in any data and do anything you want with it. So there's quite a broad mix of stuff that's out there. And some CS platforms allow you to do it. Some of them have AI machine learning models that you start up on day one and starts building these things out. So it just depends. What I love about your solution is that it's very flexible. You don't have to go, even if you're doing the basics, you still need to have to solve the data problem. You have to get that into your data model. And the biggest single thing is just making sure that you can build that out no matter what you're using. If it's Excel or Alteryx or anything else, you have to get in a format where you can do the analysis. And that's actually the easy part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. So, there's a lot of talk about machine learning and AI and whatnot, and sort of Chat GPT with their large language models kind of put that on the radar of hundreds of millions of people kind of regularly using these AI technologies. What impact do you see this has on this domain, particular, not necessarily Chat GPT, but more broadly foundational AI models applied to, from machine learning or AI applied to this domain?
Well, the thing about AI is that you have to have a very large data source in order to make it work. You have to have a big corpus of data, and that's exactly where ChatGPT comes from, right? This enormous set of language that's out there on the internet. And so when you have that much data, you can do a lot with it. The problem is a lot of companies in B2B in particular don't have that much data. So there you do wind up getting to a dead end, but there are even things that you can do using basic statistical tools like regression that will help you go from, kind of fit that gap from completely subjective to this, very elaborate AI machine learning. There's some middle ground here where you can start to use some data and make things better. So, and ChatGPT, people think it's going to do your thinking for you. It's not going to do that. Right? All it is, it's an enormous model with billions of parameters in it. And when you do a prompt, you're entering numbers into a mathematical model and it's spitting back a result to you. That's all it's doing. ChatGPT does not understand what a word is, right? It has a number associated with that word and it's giving you an association. And it's amazing what it does and the layers upon layers of it that it's doing. But at the end of the day, it's just a regression model. That's all it is, with billions of parameters in it. It's massively complex, but it's the same thing. So, the thing is that the more you know about the fundamentals, the more you know about basic statistics, things like regression, the more you're going to really understand and appreciate what's going on with ChatGPT and AI and machine learning.
Yeah.
It doesn't make you an expert, but at least you understand what it's doing. And that will be helpful in the future.
Makes sense. So Ed, you mentioned this class that you teach in the conversation earlier. Tell us a little bit more about that. Where can people find it? I know I would love to take that class and learn more from. This conversation could go on for hours and you have obviously a lot of depth and understanding here. Where can we find more information about it? And what's the best way for people to contact you?
Yeah, Success Coaching is the partner that I have for this. It's a I also have a version on Udemy if you want to do a completely self-directed, but it's data-driven decision-making for customer success. You will find that if you search on Udemy, you'll find it if you search in the catalog at Success Coaching. So that's available to you. I've taught coming up on 1,000 students have gone through either one of these. So there's growing interest in this. If you're in customer success operations or RevOps, this is fundamental stuff. You got to know it. And it's very useful. Everything that we do is applied to this space, is applied to customer success. How do I use these tools? How do I think about this? So that's there. I do have a website, SE for service excellence -partners.com. So SE-partners.com. It's my website. Connect to me on LinkedIn as well. I do a lot of stuff on LinkedIn.
Perfect. Ed, thank you so much for your time today. For those of you who joined us from the audience, a recording of this call will be available to you in about a day or so, and we'll send it out to you over email if you've registered with us. Feel free to share it with others. Let others know all the good insights and content that was raised today. Elizabeth, thank you so much for your time. The website URL is
Partners.com. Yeah. Service
So,
excellence -partners.com. SE-partners.com.
You got it. Please continue this dialogue in this conversation. 1,000 people have taken this class with Ed. I think 100,000 are actually missing out on the opportunity. So let's get everybody signed up to this thing. It's pretty cool. There's more to come on data analytics, data insights, how to leverage data, how to leverage regression modeling, and other techniques on this series in the future. So stay tuned. We do this every week. We invite a guest. We try to learn as much as we can. If you know of someone who should be a part of this conversation, please introduce us. If you would like to be a part of this conversation as a guest, let's connect. And if you have any questions about what Immersa does or how Ed can help you, just reach out to us. I'm easy to find as well. Aseem, ASEEM, @immersa.co. Thank you all for your time today. Take care.